The morning Ernest Thornwell rode into Amber Hollow, Bertha Westbrook was elbow-deep in a crate of dry goods that had arrived 2 days late and been packed by someone who clearly had never once considered that glass jars and iron hinges did not belong together. She heard the murmur move through the street before she saw anything, that particular kind of murmur that a small town reserves for something worth stopping what you are doing to look at. She did not stop what she was doing. Her younger sister Helena, however, was already at the window. "Bertha!" Helena's voice carried that soft, breathless quality it took on whenever something caught her attention. "Come look at this man." "I have work," Bertha said, setting a cracked jar aside with a quiet resignation she had long since stopped fighting. Helena did not answer. She was already smoothing her hair. Ernest Thornwell was not the kind of man who announced himself loudly. He rode a dark roan horse with the easy confidence of someone who had covered long distances and expected to cover many more. He was broad through the shoulders, unhurried in his movements, and wore the kind of weathered composure that comes not from ease, but from having survived things he did not talk about. He stopped outside the land office, tied his horse with one smooth motion, and looked up and down the main street of Amber Hollow, the way a man does when he is deciding whether a place is worth his time. Apparently, it was. He walked into the land office and did not come out for nearly an hour. By the time he emerged, half the town already knew his name, and the other half was in the process of finding out. The Westbrook General Store sat at the corner of Main and Sycamore, which meant it sat at the crossroads of everything that passed through Amber Hollow. Bertha had run it for 3 years, ever since her father's back had given out, and her mother had quietly decided that managing the household was contribution enough. Helena helped when she felt like it, which was not often, and nobody seemed to think this arrangement was anything but natural. Bertha did not resent it, or at least she had told herself that for long enough that she no longer examined the claim too closely. She was tallying the week's inventory when the door opened that first afternoon, and Ernest Thornwell stepped inside. He looked around the store the way he had looked around the street, with that same quiet assessment, unhurried, taking in details without making a production of it. His eyes moved across the shelves, the counter, the hand-lettered price cards Bertha had made herself because the printed ones cost more than they were worth. Then his eyes landed on her. "Afternoon," he said. "I'm looking for a good source of fencing wire. Someone on the street told me you might carry it, or know who does." "We carry it," Bertha said. "Grade and quantity?" he told her. She quoted him a fair price without hesitation and told him she could have the full order ready by Thursday if he paid half now. He paid the full amount without blinking, which told her 2 things: that he was serious and that he was not the kind of man who nickel and dimed. He was almost at the door when Helena appeared from the back room, and the effect was as immediate as it always was. Helena had the kind of face that interrupted conversations without saying a word, wide-set eyes, a complexion that caught light softly, and a smile that arrived slowly and stayed long. Ernest Thornwell glanced at her, nodded politely, and left. Bertha went back to her inventory. Helena stood at the door a moment longer than necessary, watching the street. He came back Thursday for the wire, as arranged. He came back the following Monday for a box of ammunition and a new canteen. The Monday after that, he came back for coffee and salt and a length of rope, and he stayed 20 minutes longer than any of those items required, because somewhere between the rope and the salt, he had asked Bertha a question about the soil composition east of town, and she had given him an answer that surprised him. "You know land," he said. "I know this valley," she said. "My father ranched here before his health went. I grew up paying attention." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. "That's a useful thing," he said. "Paying attention." She did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. He came back the following week, and the week after that. The talk started quietly, the way talk always does in small towns. Not as accusation, but as observation. Passed between women at the dry goods counter and men outside the feed store, assembled piece by piece until it became the kind of thing everyone knew without anyone having formally announced it. Earnest Thornwell was sweet on Helena Westbrook. It was the only explanation that made sense. He was a man of means, newly settled, clearly looking to build something permanent. Helena was the most beautiful woman in Amber Hollow, by general consensus. These were simply facts, and facts had a way of pointing in obvious directions. Bertha heard the talk the way she heard most things, not directly, but in the careful way people adjusted their words when she walked into a room. A softening, a slight redirect. The small kindnesses people offer when they believe someone does not know they are being pitied. She understood what they assumed. She did not correct them. What she could not explain, not to them, and increasingly not to herself, was why Ernest Thornwell spent 40 minutes on a Tuesday afternoon discussing crop rotation and water rights with her when Helena was sitting on the porch not 30 feet away. She told herself there was a practical explanation. She almost believed it. It was a conversation about her father that changed something, though she could not have said exactly when the shift happened or what it meant. Ernest had asked how the old Westbrook ranch land was being used now, and Bertha had told him plainly, leased to a neighboring outfit for grazing. Not ideal, but it kept a small income coming in while her father recovered. She said it the way she said most things, straightforwardly, without decoration. "You miss it," Ernest said. It was not a question. Bertha set down the ledger she had been holding. "I miss what it was supposed to become," she said, and then felt immediately exposed for having said it, because it was the kind of thing she did not say out loud. Ernest nodded slowly. He looked at the counter between them. "I know that feeling," he said quietly. "Building towards something and then watching the ground shift under you." She wanted to ask him what he meant. She did not ask. He left a few minutes later, but he turned back at the door, just briefly, the way a man does when he thought of something and isn't sure whether to say it. He decided not to. The door closed behind him. Bertha stood at the counter for a long moment after he was gone, her hand resting flat on the ledger, not entirely sure what had just happened or why her heart was beating the way it was. Outside, the street went on as it always did. Somewhere down the block, she could hear Helena laughing at something, bright and easy, the way Helena laughed at everything. Bertha picked up her pen and went back to the numbers. But the numbers did not come as easily as they usually did, and she did not fully understand why, or perhaps she was only beginning to, which was in some ways worse. Spring came to Amber Hollow the way it always did, gradually at first, then all at once, with wildflowers pushing through the red dirt along the creek bed, and the air losing its bite somewhere between February and March. The town seemed to exhale. People moved differently in spring, with a little more lightness, a little more willingness to linger in conversation on the street. Bertha noticed none of it particularly. She had a store to run. What she did notice was that Ernest Thornwell had begun arriving on Tuesday mornings with a regularity that could no longer be explained by supply needs alone. A man building a cattle operation did not require that much coffee. She knew this because she kept the ledger, and the ledger did not lie. She did not mention it to anyone. Helena noticed too, though she drew an entirely different conclusion. "He comes in every Tuesday," Helena said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Bertha prepared supper. She said it with that particular careful lightness people use when they are trying to sound casual about something they are not casual about at all. "He's a regular customer," Bertha said. "Bertha," Helena set down her fork, "he spent half an hour last week talking to you about fence posts. He has a lot of fence to build." Helena looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was equal parts affection and mild frustration. "You are the most stubborn woman in this valley," she said finally, and picked her fork back up. Bertha said nothing. She served the beans and changed the subject. But later that night, alone in the quiet of her room with the lamp turned low, she allowed herself a question she had been carefully avoiding for several weeks. Not a long question, just a small, dangerous one that had been sitting at the edge of her thinking like a stone she kept stepping around. What if Helena was right? She did not answer it. She blew out the lamp and told herself to sleep. The following Tuesday, Ernest arrived earlier than usual. Bertha was still arranging the morning delivery when the door opened, and she looked up expecting one of the regular farmers who came in before the heat settled and found Ernest instead, hat in hand, looking faintly uncertain in a way she had not seen on him before. "I know it's early," he said. "Store's open," she said, and went back to the crates. He did not browse the shelves or name a supply. He stood near the counter with the quiet of a man who had come to say something and was taking his time getting to it. "I wanted to ask you something," he said finally. Bertha straightened. She kept her expression even. "All right. There's a social at the Grange Hall Saturday evening." He turned his hat once in his hands. "I'd like it if you would come with me." The store was very quiet. Somewhere outside a wagon rolled past, and the sound seemed to come from a great distance. Bertha looked at him steadily. "Me," she said. Not a challenge, just a word she needed to say out loud to make sure she had heard correctly. "You," Ernest said, and there was nothing uncertain in his voice when he said it. She said she would think about it. She did not know why she said that, instead of yes or no, only that the directness of the moment had caught her somewhere unguarded, and she needed the space of a few hours to trust what she had heard. She thought about it for exactly 40 minutes before she admitted to herself that she was going. What she had not accounted for was Helena. Her sister took the news with a stillness that was worse than any outburst would have been. Helena was rarely still. She moved through life with an easy, bright energy that filled whatever room she occupied, and when that energy went quiet, it meant something was happening underneath that she was not ready to show. "He asked you," Helena said. "Yes." A pause. Helena looked at the window. "I see." Helena, "No, I'm glad." She turned back with a smile that was genuine enough, but arrived a half-second too late. "I mean that, Bertha. I do." Bertha studied her sister's face. Helena had never been unkind to her, not truly, but there was something in that half-second delay that lodged itself quietly in Bertha's chest and stayed there through the rest of the evening. The Grange Hall social was the kind of event Amber Hollow took seriously. The women brought food that represented their best efforts and pretended it was effortless. The men stood in clusters near the door until the music started, and obligation moved them toward the floor. Children ran between legs until someone's mother collected them with a firm hand. Bertha arrived with Ernest and felt the shift in the room before she had fully crossed the threshold. It was not dramatic. It was the particular quality of attention a small town gives to something it did not predict. A slight recalibration of conversations mid-sentence, eyes that moved, and then moved deliberately away. Mrs. Calloway, who had spent the better part of March implying to anyone who would listen that Ernest Thornwell was building toward a proposal to Helena, went very briefly pale, and then recovered with the practiced composure of a woman who had been wrong before and knew how to absorb it. Bertha kept her chin level and her expression pleasant. She was good at that. She had been good at that for a long time. What she was not prepared for was how it felt to walk into a room beside someone who stayed beside her, not drifting toward other conversations, not scanning the crowd for someone more interesting, but simply present, attentive, unhurried. It was an unfamiliar feeling. It unsettled her more than the stares did. They danced once near the end of the evening when the music slowed and the crowd had thinned to the people who were genuinely enjoying themselves rather than performing enjoyment. Ernest was not a showy dancer. He was steady and sure-footed, and he did not try to lead her through anything complicated, which she appreciated more than she expected. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm usually quiet," she said. Not the same kind of quiet as usual. He looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention she had come to recognize. "Something's sitting on you." She considered deflecting. It would have been easy. She was practiced at it. Instead, she said, "I keep waiting for the part where this makes sense to me." He was quiet for a moment. What part of it doesn't make sense? She did not answer immediately. The music moved around them, soft and slow. "I'm not Helena," she said finally. It came out more plainly than she intended, without any of the protective distance she would normally have put around a statement like that. Ernest looked at her with an expression that was steady and without pity, which was the only way she could have tolerated being looked at in that moment. "I know exactly who you are, Bertha," he said quietly. "That's why I'm here." She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was certainly not going to cry in the Grange Hall with half of Amber Hollow still present. But something shifted in her chest with an almost physical sensation, like a door that had been braced shut for a very long time, being gently, firmly opened from the other side. She looked away toward the far wall and composed herself in the space of 3 seconds, which was all she allowed. When she looked back, he was still watching her, patient as ever. "You're very stubborn about this," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "I've been told I'm persistent." "By who?" "Mostly people who eventually came around to seeing it as a virtue." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The ride home was quiet and easy in the way of two people who have said something real and do not need to fill the space afterward. Ernest walked her to the store door and held his hat and said good night without pressing for anything more, which told her something important about the kind of man he was. She went inside and stood in the dark store for a moment before lighting the lamp. Helena was still awake. Bertha could see the light under her bedroom door and heard the faint, deliberate sounds of someone who wanted it known they were not waiting up, while clearly having waited up. Bertha stood in the hallway between the lamp and that line of light under the door, and for the first time she felt the full, complicated weight of what was happening, not just the unfamiliar warmth of being chosen, but the quiet grief of knowing that someone she loved had wanted this, too. She raised her hand to knock. Then she lowered it. She went to her own room and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and thought about two things that could both be true at the same time: that something good was happening to her, and that goodness sometimes arrived with a cost she had not expected to pay. Outside, Amber Hollow was quiet. The creek moved somewhere in the distance. The spring air came through the window, cool and unhurried. Bertha sat with it all for a long time before she finally lay down. She did not sleep quickly, but when she did sleep, she slept deeply, which was something she had not done in longer than she could remember. Summer arrived in Amber Hollow without apology. The heat settled over the valley like a wool blanket, thick and pressing, turning the main street to dust by mid-morning and driving most sensible people indoors between noon and 3. The wildflowers that had been so cheerful in spring dried back into the red earth, and the creek ran lower, and everything took on that particular sun-bleached patience that frontier summers demanded. Bertha noticed the heat the way she noticed most things, practically, adjusting the store hours slightly, keeping the back door propped for cross-ventilation, moving the more temperature-sensitive inventory away from the south-facing window. She adapted. She always adapted. What she could not adapt around was the silence that had settled between her and Helena. It was not a cruel silence. Helena had not turned cold, or sharp, or unkind. In many ways, that would have been easier to navigate. Instead, she had become carefully, considerately warm in the way a person is when they are managing something privately and have decided not to burden anyone else with it. She helped in the store more than usual. She asked about Bertha's day with genuine attention. She was, by every visible measure, a good sister. But the ease was gone. That particular unguarded ease that had existed between them since childhood, the kind where you said half a thought and the other person finished it, had gone quiet, replaced by something more careful and more effortful. And both of them knew it, even though neither of them said so. One evening, Bertha found Helena sitting on the back step in the last light of the day, looking out at the dry garden their mother had kept years ago and no longer bothered with. Bertha sat down beside her without being invited, which was the old way between them. They sat without speaking for a while. A mockingbird worked through its repertoire somewhere in the elm tree at the fence line. "I don't want you to be unhappy," Bertha said finally. Helena was quiet for a moment. "I'm not unhappy," she said. Then, more honestly, "I'm adjusting." "To what?" Helena turned to look at her, and for just a moment the careful warmth dropped away and something more genuine showed through. Not bitterness, not resentment, but a real and human wistfulness that Bertha recognized because she had worn it herself for years without knowing it had a name. "To being surprised," Helena said quietly. "I thought I knew how things would go. I thought I knew what he would do." She paused. "I thought I knew what you would do." "What did you think I would do?" Helena almost smiled. "Step aside, the way you always do." Bertha absorbed that. It landed with a quiet accuracy that she could not argue with because it was true. She had spent the better part of her adult life stepping aside, making room, being the practical one, the useful one, the one who did not require much and therefore did not receive much, and she had told herself so many times that this was simply her nature that she had nearly stopped questioning it. "I almost did," Bertha admitted. Helena nodded slowly. She looked back at the garden. "I know." A pause. "I'm glad you didn't." Bertha looked at her sister's profile in the fading light. The fine features, the composed expression, the particular dignity of someone choosing grace over grievance, and felt a complicated rush of love that had no clean edges. "You'll be all right," Bertha said. It was not a platitude. She meant it as a true thing. "I know I will," Helena said, and this time the smile arrived without delay. "I always am." They sat until the light was fully gone, and the mockingbird found somewhere else to be, and when they went inside, they moved through the kitchen together with something that was not quite the old ease, but was its honest successor, tested, quieter, and in some ways stronger, for what it had come through. Ernest noticed the change in Bertha that summer, though he did not name it immediately. She was still herself, direct, capable, unhurried in her speech, but something in her had loosened slightly, the way a knot loosens when the tension that created it is finally released. She laughed more readily. She disagreed with him more openly, which he found he enjoyed considerably. She stopped qualifying her own opinions before she gave them. He began to understand the full dimensions of what she had been carrying alone for a long time, and the understanding settled into something quiet and certain in his chest. He had not come to Amber Hollow looking for this. He had come looking for land and solitude and the kind of clean start a man sometimes needs after life has rearranged itself without his permission. He had not expected the woman behind the general store counter with flour on her sleeve and a ledger under her arm and the most direct eyes he had encountered in years. But he had learned early that the best things rarely arrived on schedule. He asked her father's permission on a Tuesday morning in late July, which everyone later agreed was a very Earnest Thornwell thing to do. Practical, unhurried, without ceremony, but not without respect. Walter Westbrook received him in the front room with the careful assessment of a man who had once been strong and still had all his faculties, even if his body had betrayed him. He asked Ernest 3 questions. Ernest answered all 3 without evasion. Walter sat with the answers for a long moment, looking at the man across from him with the particular scrutiny of a father measuring whether someone was worthy of something irreplaceable. Then he nodded once, slowly, and said, "She'll argue with you." "I count on it," Ernest said. Walter almost smiled. "All right then." Bertha did not know any of this until the following Saturday afternoon, when the store was quiet in the heavy post-noon heat, and she was reconciling the month's accounts, and Ernest walked in and stood at the counter and looked at her with that steady, unhurried attention that she had long since stopped trying to deflect. She set down her pen. He reached into his coat pocket and set something on the counter between them, a small ring, plain gold, without excess ornamentation, the kind of thing chosen by someone who had paid attention to who she was. "I'm not good at speeches," he said, "so I'll just say the plain thing. I want to build my life with you, Bertha. Not because there's no one else, because there's no one else I want." The store was very quiet. The heat pressed at the windows. Somewhere down the street a door opened and closed, and the ordinary sounds of Amber Hollow went on exactly as they always did, indifferent to the fact that something was happening inside the Westbrook General Store that would not unhappen. Bertha looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought about every Tuesday morning, every conversation about soil and fence posts and water rights, every moment she had talked herself out of believing what was plainly in front of her. "You should know," she said carefully, "that I have opinions about how the east pasture should be managed." "I'm aware," he said, "and I won't give up the store." "I never asked you to." She picked up the ring. It fit as though it had been made for her hand, which she later learned it had. He had quietly asked her mother for the measurement 2 weeks prior, which made her mother cry and made Bertha feel, when she heard it, a warmth so thorough it reached places that had been cold for a very long time. "All right," she said. It was not a grand declaration. It was the most Bertha Westbrook thing she could possibly have said, and Ernest looked at her as though it was exactly enough. The news moved through Amber Hollow with the particular velocity reserved for things no one saw coming. Mrs. Calloway revised her opinions with impressive speed. The men outside the feed store nodded with the expressions of people pretending they had suspected as much. The women who had quietly pitied Bertha recalibrated with varying degrees of grace. Helena heard it from their mother before Bertha could tell her herself, which was not how Bertha had wanted it to happen. She found her sister in the garden, the same dry patch of ground where they had sat together in the evening light weeks before, and Helena turned when she heard her coming and opened her arms without a word. Bertha walked into them, and they stood there for a long moment in the summer heat, two sisters and everything complicated and uncomplicated between them. "He's a good man," Helena said into her shoulder. "I know," Bertha said. "You deserve a good man." Bertha pulled back and looked at her sister's face, which was open and genuine, and only a little bit brave. "So do you," she said firmly, "and you'll find one." Helena wiped her eye with the back of her hand in a quick, dismissive gesture. "Obviously," she said. "I'm Helena Westbrook." Bertha laughed. It came out fuller than she expected, real and unguarded, and Helena laughed too. And for a moment it was the old ease again, unqualified, unheld back, completely itself. They married in October, when the heat had broken and the valley had turned the particular gold and amber that gave the town its name. The ceremony was held at the small church on the north end of Main Street, attended by most of Amber Hollow and conducted by a minister who kept the words simple and the occasion dignified. Bertha wore her mother's altered dress and carried no flowers because she had told the florist practically that she had nowhere to put them during the ceremony and would rather have her hands free. Ernest stood at the front of the church with the expression of a man who had been waiting for something important to begin. When she walked down the aisle, she did not look at the assembled faces of Amber Hollow, all of them recalibrated and present and watching. She looked at him, and he looked at her with that same steady, unhurried attention, the attention that had started it all, that had found her behind a counter with flour on her sleeve and a ledger under her arm, and had not looked away. Walter Westbrook, seated in the front pew with a cane he hated and a dignity he had never lost, reached over and took his wife's hand, without looking at her. Helena, seated beside them, looked straight ahead with shining eyes and a smile that was entirely genuine. In the years that followed, the Thornwell Ranch east of Amber Hollow became known for two things: the quality of its cattle and the fact that decisions were made jointly between a man who was persistent and a woman who had opinions about the east pasture and had been right about them from the start. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The girl had Bertha's directness and Ernest's patience, which everyone agreed was a formidable combination. The store passed to Helena, who ran it with a warmth and capability that surprised no one who had actually been paying attention, and who eventually found her own good man, a quietly spoken veterinarian named George Harrell, who had come through Amber Hollow one autumn and found reasons to stay. Bertha never stopped keeping ledgers. She simply had more to account for now. More land, more seasons, more of the particular richness that accumulates in a life that is fully inhabited. On Tuesday mornings, sometimes, Ernest would come in from the east pasture early and find her at the kitchen table with the accounts spread before her, the same way she had looked that first afternoon across the store counter. And he would set a cup of coffee beside her without interrupting, and she would look up briefly and then back down at her work. And that was enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that takes years to build and lasts considerably longer. This story has traveled farther than Amber Hollow ever could, carried by whoever is watching right now, wherever in this world you happen to be. Whether you are somewhere cold and quiet, somewhere warm and busy, or somewhere in between, I would genuinely love to know where these stories are reaching. Drop your city, your country, or even just your corner of the world in the comments. It means more than you might think. And if something in this story moved you, or if you have thoughts on what could be told better, written differently, or explored more deeply, please say so. Every suggestion shapes the next story, and the next one is already waiting. If slow burn stories about quiet people living consequential lives are what you stay for, there are more where this came from.